Last week, we kicked off a new series called The Good Life. And I gave you this 30,000-foot view of the series. And essentially, the good life is this, right? We wake up every day. We do our thing. We go to school. We go to work. We interact with the people around us. Like, it's just our normal routine. But how often in that routine, in our day-to-day life, do we stop and ask the question, hey, am I really living my best life? Am I right now living the good life? Now, if I were to ask you to raise your hands, I'm sure a lot of you would say, Chris, I want that. I want to live the good life. That would be awesome, but I'm not sure what that looks like. The good news is that you can live the good life right now. In this season where you are, you can live the good life. Now, for us to be able to figure out what the good life is and really define that, we're walking through the book of Philippians over the next few weeks. And the reason we decided to do that is because if anyone got it, if there was ever anybody that understood the tension of trying to live the good life, it was Paul. Okay, Paul writes this letter, Philippians, to his friends, and he's in prison, but he writes a letter. Now, even though he's in chains, even though his current reality sucks, he writes to encourage them. He tells them, hey, it is possible for you to have joy, for you to have hope, for you to find purpose, no matter what your circumstances are. And we said this last week as we looked at chapter 1, the good life is not connected to anything external, okay? We're not going to arrive at the good life. We're not going to land somewhere and be like, okay, I'm there. I'm content, I'm happy if we're only focusing on what is external. It's not about that perfect relationship. It's not only about getting good grades. It's not just about making a lot of money. The good life is not about your status or your influence. Last week we began to talk about and define the good life as this. The good life is about us beginning to understand God's love for us, and then letting his love for us begin to influence how we love other people. You see, Paul got this because even sitting in prison, he was so convicted and understood God's love for him that he could not help but love the people around him, even though he was sitting in chains. And he was convinced that he was living the good life, even while he was living in prison. And so he writes this letter to encourage his friends. And he says, hey, no matter what your current circumstances, no matter if everything around you seems to be falling apart, you can still find joy and fulfillment, even in the midst of that. And at the end of chapter 1, he gives us this thought. This is where we landed last week in Philippians chapter 1, verse 27. He says, hey, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ. Essentially, Paul is saying, hey, make decisions that reflect the gospel. Or you could say it like this, hey, live your life in harmony with the message of Jesus. Now, Paul didn't write his letter in chapters, right? I mean, you don't write, if you write a letter, has anybody ever written a letter to somebody? Okay, a few girls. Oh, there's some guys that raise their hand. Yeah, most of the time we write emails or texts. We don't write a whole lot of letters. But when you write a letter, you don't chapter 1, I think you're awesome. Chapter 2, here's what my day was like, right? We don't write in chapters. Paul didn't write in chapters. He was just writing a letter. But there were some ideas. There were some breaks in that letter, right? And so later on, somebody's reading this letter that he wrote, and they put in these chapter breaks. And so as he says this in our version of Philippians at the end of chapter 1, he starts talking about how we should live our life. This idea of how we live our life flows into chapter 2, because Paul didn't write in chapters, right? And so it flows into chapter 2, and he begins to talk to us about how to live a life worthy of the good news of Christ. He begins to talk to us about what it looks like for us to live a life that's in harmony with the message of Jesus. And Paul is going to point out something that we all have to deal with. His friends in Philippi had to deal with it. You have to deal with it. I have to deal with it. In fact, the topic that we're going to talk about tonight, I believe, is one of the biggest things that stands in stark contrast to the message of Jesus. What Paul talks about in chapter 2 is he talks about how we all have to deal with selfishness. Now, here's what's interesting about selfishness. No one had to teach us how to be selfish, did they? We don't have to practice selfishness. It just comes naturally. We're really good at being selfish. Okay, I won't speak for you. Okay, I don't even know some of you. I am really good at being selfish. I want what I want. And here's the thing, like, not only am I good at it, like, it's just, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to practice it. I don't have to worry about, man, am I doing a good job of being selfish today? Like, it's just, it comes naturally. It's like hardwired into who I am. I have 2 girls. I have 2 little girls, okay? Landry is 3. Campbell is 1. They are the cutest kids ever. I can say that because I'm their dad. If you saw them, you would also say that, okay? They're the cutest kids ever, but wow, they are so good at being selfish. Even at 1-year-old and 3 years old, they're so good at being selfish. I realized one day, as your kids start learning vocabulary, right? They're like saying dada and mama and bottle and puppy and diaper and like they're learning all of these words, right? A word that we never set out to teach them that they just learned was mine, right? Mine. I'm like, I don't remember having this lesson sitting down with Landry and like, okay, Landry, this is like a ball, right? This is mine. Because I didn't have to teach that to her. She just figured it out. And I'm telling you, my kids will get scrappy. If they think you're going to take something that belongs to them, you better watch out, okay? Because they're really, really good at being selfish, especially Landry. I'm calling her out. It's scary. She's 3 years old. She's really good at being selfish. I'm sure Campbell will be a professional selfish person. I'm not sure where I was going with that. But it's just kind of who they are. Even at like 3 years old, it's who they are. If you have siblings, you know what selfish people look like, right? If you have roommates, if you share a bathroom, or even if you share a room with somebody, you have experienced it firsthand when someone else is selfish, right? If you're in a romantic relationship, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you know what it looks like when somebody's selfish. Even scarier, if you're honest, you know what it looks like and how selfish you can be, right? Now, if you're like, Chris, my boyfriend's not selfish, my girlfriend's not selfish, just give it time. You haven't dated long enough, okay? You're like in that puppy love phase of your relationship. Like, everybody has to deal with selfishness at some point because everybody is in it for their own best interest. They want what is theirs. They are like, I don't care about anyone else. Just give it time. Everybody is selfish. We've seen selfishness rear its ugly head in different aspects of our life. It's what leads to drama. Selfishness is what leads to fighting, right? Selfishness is what breaks our harmony in the relationships with the people around us. Because we want what we want, and they want what they want. And when those two things don't align, it's really hard to be in harmony when everyone's being selfish and looking out for their best interests. Selfishness urges us to take care of ourselves first. Selfishness compels us, hey, ignore the needs of other people until after your needs are taken care of. Who has taken a cookie and somebody said, hey, can I have a piece of that? And you break it in half and then you're like, smaller half, right? That's just what we do. Like, we didn't even necessarily make the conscious decision, like, I'm going to be a jerk. I'm going to give them the smaller half because I'm more important than they are. And by the way, it was my cookie to start out with. And so really, I'm being very gracious because I'm letting you have a piece of the cookie that was bestowed to me. It is my right as a human being to own and eat this cookie. And so for me to let you partake, I am being gracious. How in the world could you possibly get mad at me for giving you the smaller piece of cookie? Like, we didn't think about all of that, right? We just said, smaller piece, here you go. Right? Because that's just who we are. But if we have this kind of selfishness in our life, it makes it really hard. It makes it virtually impossible to live in harmony with the message of Jesus Christ. Like, if we have this, it makes it impossible to live in harmony with other people. And here's the reality. If we want to live in harmony with the message of Jesus, if we want to be able to walk out Philippians 1:27, we have to live in harmony with the people around us. We need to figure this out, because the good life is never the result of a selfish life. It's just not. And initially, selfishness feels so good because we get what we want, right? We feel like we're winning, but then we look around and we realize that it's gone. It was fleeting, and now it's kind of hollow. We feel a little lonely. We feel isolated. We need to figure this selfishness thing out. Selfishness doesn't look good on anybody. And that's why Paul talks about selfishness when he starts talking about how to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ, the good news of Christ. Now, we know a little bit about where Philippians came from. We talked about this last week. Paul went to Rome to tell people about Jesus because he had experienced the love of God in his life. It compelled him to go and love the people around him. And so he goes to Rome. He begins to tell people about Jesus. And there are some people in Rome that didn't like it. It wasn't a popular decision. And so they take Paul, they throw him in prison. Now, when Paul's friends in Philippi heard that he was in prison, they were concerned. They were worried for him. And so they sent their pastor, Epaphroditus, to visit Paul in prison. And so they wanted him to encourage Paul. So Epaphroditus goes and he visits Paul in prison. And eventually, as with any prison visit, it's time for Epaphroditus to go home. And as Epaphroditus is getting ready to leave, Paul says, hey, before you leave, I want to write a letter, and I want to send it with you to my friends in Philippi. Here's why I think that's so cool. Philippians is not just words on a page, a book in the Bible. Like, Philippians was actually a letter that was written by a real human being and was sent to other people. And then at some point along the way, we found that letter, and then it made its way into the Bible. But it's an actual letter where Paul is encouraging his friends in Philippi. So we pick it up in Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 3, it says this. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Don't be selfish. Paul doesn't really pull a lot of punches here, does he? He just gives it to us straightforward. He says, hey, don't be selfish. It basically applies to every situation in our life. He doesn't say, hey, don't be selfish in this area or don't be selfish in this area. No, he just makes a blanket statement. He says, in life, don't be selfish. Like, don't be a selfish roommate. Don't be a selfish friend. Don't be selfish with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. Don't be selfish. Don't be selfish when you're working on a group project. Well, now we're getting serious. Basically, Paul is saying, hey, what's your motivation in the decisions that you're making? Like, why do you decide to do the things that you do? Is it for your interest? Is it for someone else's interest? Like, don't be selfish. Don't try and impress other people. Like, why do you post things on social media? How do you choose how you invest your time and your energy? Why do you speak to people the way that you speak to them? He's like, hey, don't do anything. Don't make any decisions at the expense of someone else. Essentially, Paul is saying this, hey, don't enter into a win-lose transaction with other people. Here's what I mean by win-lose transaction. When I make a decision or when I do something and I win and you lose, that's a win-lose transaction. When I do something that's in my best interest, but it actually hurts your interest, that's a win-lose transaction. And Paul's saying, hey, don't do that. It's kind of like this ladder. Every time you take a step up the ladder, you're creating separation between you and someone else, right? And so you make a decision that's in your best interest. You take another step up the ladder. You're starting to feel good about yourself because you're elevating yourself. You're getting somewhere. You're feeling good. You have a better view, right? You can see further. And so we feel so often like when we make these decisions to take the step up the ladder that it's in our best interest, and so we keep doing it. There are lots of things that could be this, right? Like when your roommate has a big test tomorrow and they've told you They're like, hey, man, I've been studying. I think I'm going to go to bed early tonight. And you decide you're going to invite some friends over to have movie night. Now, you knew that your roommate had a test, and they were going to bed early, and they were kind of stressed out. But you have friends over. You have movie night anyway. Y'all make noise late into the night. Man, you took another step up at that ladder, didn't you? It was a win-lose transaction. It was good for you. You had fun. Chris, we were building community. Yeah, that's great for you, but it was at the expense of your roommate. Or when you're in that group project, some of y'all are worried I'm going to keep going up this ladder, aren't you? When you're in that group project and you know that everyone in that group is too nice to call you out, so you decide you're not going to pull your weight, you just coast. You're like, I'm going to get a good grade. I'm going to be happy. And you know that they're not going to call you out. It's not going to cost you anything. That's a win-lose transaction. It's like, yeah, I looked out for what was in it for me, but I didn't really care about how it affected the people around me. And Paul's saying, hey, don't do that. Don't be selfish. It isn't all about you. You need to eliminate win-lose transactions in your life. Quit elevating yourself. It may seem like you're winning right now, but it's actually lose-lose because it hurts the relationships in your life. It breaks the trust of the people in your life. People begin to look at you differently. They begin to think about you differently. They begin to recognize that you're selfish. They begin to see that you're ultimately only in it for you. You know people like this. You know people that you're like, man, they never consider how their decisions impact other people. Sometimes you're on the receiving end of that. Sometimes decisions they make hurt people that you love and you get defensive about it, right? We make those decisions all the time and we feel like we're winning, but at the end of the day, it is lose-lose. And so what do we do? What's the alternative? Well, Paul immediately speaks to this. He continues in verse 3. He says, don't be selfish. Don't try and impress others. And he says this, be humble, thinking of others better than yourselves. He offers a better way. I think it was the philosopher Kendrick Lamar that said, sit down, be humble, right? Y'all are like, I didn't know you knew who that was. Paul is telling us to value other people more than we value ourselves. That doesn't mean that you need to have a low self-esteem. It doesn't mean that you need to look at yourself poorly or think you're a bad person or like diminish who you are. But when he starts talking about us valuing other people, I think it was Rick Warren that said it. He said it in Purpose-Driven Life. He said, humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking about yourself less. Like, quit making everything about you. That's what Paul is talking about when he says, hey, put the needs of other people ahead of yourself. And then Paul continues in verse 4. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. Paul gives us a different definition of humility than we're used to. It's a different definition than the people around us use every day. Because when we think of humility, we think, okay, humility means that I am just not going to tell people how awesome I am, right? Like that's essentially what humility means to most of us. It's like, well, I'm not going to brag. I mean, I'm really awesome, but I'm not going to tell everyone that I'm awesome. Like, I'm being humble. Like, that's our stereotypical definition of humility. But Paul gives us a definition. He says it's way different than that. It's not just like talking about yourself less. It's actually putting other people before you. It's putting the interests of other people ahead of your own interests. And we talked earlier about how selfishness doesn't look good on anybody. Humility looks good on everybody. Humility looks good on everybody. And in a world where we're encouraged to look out for ourselves, where it's all about self-preservation, where selfishness is expected and in most cases celebrated, like humility is so refreshing. Humble people are helpful people. Humble people are happy people. I would even say that humility is compelling. People are drawn to humble people. Humility looks good on everybody. Now, why do you think we're drawn to humble people? I think there are a couple of reasons, but the first one is this. humble people rarely talk about themselves. It's refreshing because people talk about themselves all the time. Like, I love me some me. And so when we enter into a conversation, normally in my head, I'm like, how can I spin this and talk about me, right? We do that all the time, but humble people rarely talk about themselves. When you have a conversation with a humble person, you feel like they're actually listening to you. Like they're interested in what you have to say. They're not trying to one-up you. They're not trying to tell a better story or make it sound like their life is better or worse than yours, right? No, a humble person is genuinely interested in who you are. Here's another one. Why are we drawn to humble people? They go out of their way to see things from your view. Humble people are willing to go out of their way, to change their posture, to come down off the ladder to see things from your perspective. Like, they're empathetic. Humble people have empathy for the people around them. They genuinely want to know what it is that you're experiencing, what it is that you're walking through. A humble person is curious. They care about the needs and the wants and the desires of the people around them. And here's the last thing, and obviously this list could go on, but just one more thing. A humble person is good at serving others. They literally look for opportunities to serve. Now, a normal person like me, I'll wait for you to ask and then maybe I'll help you, right? Or I'll pretend like I didn't get that text where you're like, hey, can you help me? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't see that. I'm so sorry. I wish that I could have helped you, but you know it's too late, right? So you try to make yourself look good like you actually cared, but you didn't respond until 6 hours later when they needed something 5 hours ago, right? No, a humble person genuinely cares, and a humble person will go out of their way to meet someone else's need and to help them and to serve them. You could sum it up like this: valuing other people makes you more valuable to other people. Valuing other people makes you more valuable to other people. This is the good life. It will transform the kind of person you are. It will transform the kind of roommate you are. It will transform the way that you date. It will transform the way that you interact with other people. When you begin to value other people, it actually makes you more valuable to other people. So in some ways, it kind of scratches the itch of selfishness. When we can lay ourselves down and say, hey, I'm going to make this about you, man, I still have these wants and desires, but when we become more valuable to other people, it's when we're valuing them, when we're placing them ahead of us, and we are doing that in humility. But let's be real, this is not easy, right? We can't just hope that we become humble. I like the view from the top of the ladder. It's nice. I'm selfish. So what do? It's not just about hoping that I become humble. What does that look like? I think Paul got that. I think he understood that it wasn't easy. And so immediately after telling us, he's like, hey, this is what the good life looks like. This is what it looks like to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ. Immediately after that, he gives us an example of the humility he's talking about. Verses 5 and 6 say this: you must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Now, quick theology lesson on Jesus. When Jesus was on earth, he was fully God and fully man at the same time. So he was equal to God, even though he was wearing skin and bones just like you and me. And so it would have been easy for Jesus to have an elevated view of himself, right? Because he knew he was God. And when you have an elevated view of yourself, you have an expectation on how people treat you. When you have an elevated view of yourself, when you like being up here on the ladder, you have an expectation for how people talk to you, for how they interact with you. It would have been so easy for Jesus to walk around like he owned the place. He did, right? But Paul says, hey, that's not how Jesus responded. Jesus, if there was ever anyone that could say, do you know who I am? And get away with it, it was Jesus. But Paul says he did exactly the opposite when he continues in verse 7. He says, instead instead of thinking of himself highly, instead of having an elevated view of himself, instead of recognizing that he was fully God, says instead of doing those things and being selfish and expecting people to treat him a certain way or expecting people to talk to him a certain way or to take care of his needs, instead of all of those things, he gave up his divine privilege. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. This is the ultimate example of what humility looks like. This is the ultimate example of what it looks like to serve someone else, to put their needs, their wants, their desires ahead of your own. Jesus gave up everything. It cost him his life, but he did it willingly and humbly for you and for me, to set the example and to show us what it looked like for us to genuinely care for and love the people around us. Here's the deal. We talked last week, the good life starts when we begin to understand the good work of the cross, the gospel, that Jesus came, he died for our sins, God loves us, he desires a relationship with us. And so the good life starts with an understanding of God's love for us. And then the good work continues in our life when we begin to love the people around us, right? We talked about that last week. It's in Philippians chapter 1. And then because of the work that's going on inside of us, because we're compelled to love the people around us, we're called to live a life worthy of God's love, worthy of what God has done for us. This is really important. It's not enough to say that. It's not enough to know that. We have to do that, which is why Paul begins to connect these dots. He paints a picture. He tells us, hey, this is what it looks like. Here's the gospel. Here's the good work. Here's what you're called to. And then here's how you do it. He doesn't say, hey, you need to know this. It's really important. Hey, you need to understand what Christ did for you. His message didn't end there. His message continued, and he said, not only is it important for you to know it, now you have to live it. Now you have to walk it out. And he says, this is the good life. The good life is when you give away yourself, when you put your needs, your wants, your selfishness, when you put it aside and you actually step out and leverage yourself for the good of someone else. That's when you're living the good life. That's when you're experiencing the fullness of what God has for you. I'm telling you, if you can grab a hold of this, this is the good life. What if this week you started making intentional decisions to ask more questions? There we go. We don't want to ask less questions. What if you made the intentional decision to ask more questions and state your opinion less? What if you began to consider how your decisions impact the people around you? That may be your roommate. That may be your boyfriend or your girlfriend. That may be the person that gets onto a full bus and you can just tell they're having one of those days and you're sitting there all nice and comfortable and you're like, hey, you know what? I'm going to let you sit down. It's the simple stuff. It's the little stuff of, hey, I'm going to go out of my way to serve. I'm going to go out of my way to love. What if instead of posting about yourself on social media this week, you used your voice to encourage people, to lift someone else up, to celebrate the people around you? What if you began to ask the question, how can I serve, instead of asking the question, what's in it for me? Lasting fulfillment, the good life, is found on the other side of giving, not getting. You know this is true, right? Even at Christmas, we hear it all the time. It's better to give than to receive, but it's true. We feel more fulfilled. We experience more life when we give rather than when we get. This is the good life. Live that life. Sit down. Be humble. Let's pray.